Hi, this is Lee from the Law School Toolbox. Today, I'm going to talk about something that pretty much every law student stresses about at some point: how much your grades actually matter and for which kinds of jobs. We'd like to take a moment to thank Juno for sponsoring this podcast. Do you have student loans or are you considering taking them out? Juno can help you understand your options and access more competitive rates. Juno works by using collective bargaining, negotiating as a group with lenders to secure lower private student loan rates than students typically get on their own. This can mean real upfront savings because loan interest is no joke. Take it from someone who spent years paying off law school loans. To learn more about Juno, visit joinjuno.com and check out our previous podcast with Juno's founder, linked to in the show notes. It's definitely worth a listen. So the question I want to tackle today is one I get some version of all the time from students. It usually sounds like, my grades aren't what I had hoped. Is my legal career over? Or sometimes it's the flip side. I'm doing well. Do I have to keep killing myself or can I relax a little? And the honest answer, which is not a very satisfying answer, I'll admit, is that it really depends on what kind of job you want. Because grades matter hugely for some career paths, somewhat for others, and genuinely not very much for quite a few. And law students almost never get a realistic picture of this because the loudest conversation at most law schools is about OCI and big law and federal clerkships, where grades matter a ton. So if that's all you're hearing, and especially if you're at a school that sends a lot of students into big law, it can feel like your whole life is riding on your 1L GPA, which let me just say up front, it is not. But it also kind of is for some paths. So today, I want to walk through, honestly, where grades matter a lot, where they matter somewhat, and where they really don't matter much at all. And then probably more importantly, for most of you listening, what you should actually be doing if your grades aren't what you had hoped. Now, before I dive in, a quick caveat. I'm not telling anyone not to try. Better grades are better than worse grades. Always. If you can get the A, get the A. If you can get on law review, get on law review. The question I'm addressing today is really about what it means if you find yourself in the middle of the curve, or honestly, below the middle, because that's where most law students end up mathematically, by definition. And it doesn't mean your career is over. It just means you need to think a little more strategically. Okay. Let's start with the category where grades really do matter, because I think it's helpful to be honest about this up front. The first one, and probably the most grade-dependent path in the legal profession, is federal clerkships, especially at the appellate level, and certainly at the Supreme Court level. If you want a federal clerkship, grades are a huge factor. Judges get hundreds of applications for every clerkship slot. And the first cut they make is usually based on grades and law review status. It's not the only thing they look at. They care about your writing sample, your recommendations, whether you fit the judge's working style. But if you don't make that first cut on paper, you don't get to the interesting part of the process where those other things come into play. And I'll say the more prestigious the clerkship, the more true this is. State trial court clerkships are often much more accessible, and the employer is looking at the whole package rather than just grades. So don't rule out clerkships entirely if you're not at the top of your class. But if you have your heart set on a feeder judge or a circuit court clerkship or something like that, you really need to be at or near the top. We've actually done a couple of episodes specifically on clerkships. So I'd point you to episode 44, where we discuss this with someone from UC Law in San Francisco. And then a later episode with Kelsey Russell, who is a federal judicial clerk. Both have a lot more detail if this is a path you're seriously considering. We will link to them in the show notes. The second big category is big law, specifically big law through the on-campus interview process, which most students call OCI. A lot of the large firms have pretty explicit GPA cutoffs that they use to screen resumes before they even agree to interview you. And this varies by school, which is really important to understand. A firm might take the top 10% at one school, the top 25% at another school, and basically anyone with a pulse at Yale or Harvard because you're at a top 14 school. Just having gotten in is a signal, and the firms trust the admissions process. But if you're at a more regional school, those firms are going to rely much more heavily on class rank to figure out who to interview. This is a place where I really encourage students to have a conversation with their career services office because they'll usually know what the typical cutoffs have been at your school historically. That information is really useful for setting realistic expectations about OCI. The third category where grades really matter is legal academia. If you want to be a law professor someday, you need the whole package. Top grades, law review, prestigious clerkship, elite law school. That path is incredibly credential-driven, and there's not much you can do to work around it once your grades are set, unless you gain some notoriety as a practitioner. So those are the three: federal clerkships, big law through OCI, and legal academia. In those worlds, grades are doing a lot of the work of getting you in the door. So what about the middle category? Because it's not like grades stop mattering the moment you step outside of big law and federal clerkships. In the somewhat matters bucket, I'd put mid-sized firms, boutique firms, government honors programs. So that's DOJ honors, federal agency honors programs, some state attorney general offices, and in-house positions, although those are usually not entry-level jobs coming straight out of law school. The government honors programs are really interesting because they're actually extremely competitive. DOJ honors is genuinely hard to get, so grades matter there, but they're also looking a lot at your demonstrated commitment to the mission of the agency, the quality of your writing, your interview performance, and any relevant experience. So grades get your resume looked at, but they won't get you the job by themselves. Mid-size and boutique firms, in my experience, are often more flexible than big law on grades, but it really depends on the specific firm. A highly specialized litigation boutique might care a lot about grades because the work is demanding and they're looking for people who can handle complex analysis. But a mid-sized regional firm that does a lot of insurance defense or real estate work might care much more about whether you seem like you'd be pleasant to work with for 10 hours a day. Which, by the way, is a very real consideration in hiring, probably more real than most law students appreciate. The key thing about this middle category is that grades are a factor, but they're one factor among several. The things that can offset middling grades in this category are relevant work experience, a clear and genuine interest in what the employer does, strong writing samples, good references, and just being a friendly, pleasant human being in an interview. And that last one, again, is deeply underrated. There are plenty of students with great grades who may come across as arrogant in interviews, and they lose out to students with worse grades. Now let's get into what I think is actually the most useful part of this episode for most of you listening, which is the category where grades really don't matter very much at all, because a lot of people don't realize how many legal jobs really don't hinge on your GPA. So let me list some of these. Small firms, meaning firms with fewer than 20 lawyers, very often care much more about whether you can actually do the work and whether you fit in with the culture than they care about whether you got a B+ or a B- in civil procedure. And here's the thing. Small firms are where most lawyers actually practice. Big law is this highly visible slice of the profession, but it's a small minority of actual legal jobs. The majority of lawyers in this country are in small firms or are solo practitioners. Most of them are not asking about your 1L torts grade. They want to know if you can draft a motion, talk to a client without melting down, and show up on time. We did an episode with Jeremy Richter back in episode 116 about life as a small firm associate, and that's a great listen if you want to get a realistic picture of what that looks like. We'll share a link in the show notes. Public interest is another area where grades matter less, though public interest is still competitive, just competitive in a different way. Public interest employers want to see demonstrated commitment. They want to see clinics, volunteer work, relevant internships, and a story about why you care about the issue area. Grades are part of the picture, but they're not the picture. We did a great episode on this with Ashley Matthews from Equal Justice Works, episode 101. So check that out if public interest is on your radar. We'll link to it in the show notes. Local prosecutor and public defender offices are similar. These jobs are often really sought after, but the selection process tends to be much more about your interview, your writing sample, and whether the hiring attorney can picture you actually doing the job. I know several lawyers who got DA or PD jobs with very middle-of-the-road grades because they absolutely crushed the interview and had done multiple externships at the office during law school. Plaintiff-side firms, especially smaller plaintiff firms doing personal injury, employment law, or consumer work, those firms often care much more about whether you can write well, whether you can talk to clients and witnesses, and whether you have some drive and hustle. They are not screening candidates on GPA. Family law, immigration, criminal defense, same deal. These are practice areas where the work is very client-facing, so it's often emotionally intense, and the skills that matter are much more about communication, empathy, project management, and just being reliable and responsive. Then there's this whole other universe of legal and legal-adjacent jobs that a lot of law students don't even know exist. Compliance, contracts management, legal operations, legal tech, policy work, legislative drafting. Many of these don't care about your grades at all. They care about what you can do, and often about whatever specialized background you're bringing to the role. And then the entrepreneurial paths, starting your own firm, going in-house at a startup, doing legal consulting. No one is looking at your transcript when you're the one signing the paychecks. If you want to hang out a shingle after passing the bar, nobody cares what grade you got in property. Okay, so this brings me to what I think is the most important part of the episode for some. You're listening to this, your grades are not what you hoped they'd be, and you're feeling like your options are narrowing. So what should you actually be doing? Well, first, a quick reassurance. If you're a 1L and you just got one set of disappointing grades, go listen to episode 28. We'll link to it in the show notes. We did a whole episode on dealing with bad first semester grades, including how to evaluate your study process and turn things around for second semester. And episode 9 is specifically about raising your grades as a 2L or 3L. So if you're in Can I Still Fix This mode, there's a lot of content on that already. But let's assume you've done that work, or maybe you've just made peace with the fact that you're going to be a solidly middle-of-the-pack student. So what do you actually do? Well, the first thing, and I think this is the mindset shift that matters most, is to stop thinking of your law school career as just your transcript. Your transcript is one piece of your professional story. The other pieces are your work experience, your writing samples, your references, your network, and your story, meaning who you are. What do you care about? And why should somebody hire you specifically over the 100 other people who also applied for this job? Each of those is something you can actually build and control, even if your grades are locked in. So let's go through them. Practical experience. If you're not going to be able to compete on GPA, you need to be competing on experience. That means externships, clinics, internships during the school year, summer jobs that matter. Get into a clinic if your school has one. Do pro bono work, take skills-based classes, negotiation, trial advocacy, drafting courses. Employers at almost every level love to see that you've actually done legal work and can speak to it intelligently. And honestly, a lot of students with great grades don't do this stuff because they're busy maintaining their great grades. So there's a real opportunity here for students who are willing to invest in the experiential side. Writing samples. This one is huge. If you can come out of law school with a really polished, substantive writing sample, whether it's from a journal note, a seminar paper, a brief from a clinic, or a memo from a summer job that you've been able to redact and use, it can absolutely offset middle-of-the-pack grades. Employers care deeply about whether you can write because so much of legal work is writing. A strong writing sample is evidence that you can actually do the job. And that's ultimately what hiring managers are trying to figure out. Relationships and networking. I know we talk about networking on this podcast a lot, and I know it makes a lot of people cringe, but it really matters. And it matters especially if you're not going to be able to rely on OCI or a GPA cutoff to hand you a job. Most jobs outside of big law and formal honors programs are not gotten through a structured process. They're gotten because someone knows you, vouches for you, or pulls your resume out of the pile and says, I met this person. I liked them. Let's interview them. So the people to invest in are your professors, alums of your school, lawyers you meet at externships and internships, people you meet at bar events. Be a person who's worth helping. Show up, do good work, stay in touch, send thank you notes, follow up when you say you will. That stuff sounds so basic, but it genuinely is how a lot of jobs get filled. Geography. Your prospects can look really different depending on where you're willing to practice. A student with middle-of-the-class grades who's willing to go to a smaller market often has a much easier time finding a good job than a student with the same grades trying to stay in New York or DC or San Francisco. A small firm in Boise or Des Moines or Chattanooga is going to be thrilled to have a solid law school graduate who wants to put down roots. A small firm in Manhattan has a lot of options. So if you have geographic flexibility, that's a real asset, and it's one that students very often don't think about strategically. Specialization. If you can develop a genuine expertise or focused interest in a specific area of law, say health law or IP with a technical background, or immigration or data privacy, you can become the person employers in that niche want to hire, regardless of where you fell on the curve. This is especially powerful if your prior career or education gives you a substantive background in that area. If you are a nurse before law school and you want to do medical malpractice or healthcare regulatory work, that nursing background is going to matter much more to a lot of employers than your contracts grade. Same thing if you were an engineer going into patent law, or a teacher going into education law, or a social worker going into family law. Prior career experience is huge, and it's one of the most under-leveraged assets for non-traditional students. We did episode 98 specifically about non-traditional law students. If that's you, you should check it out. And finally, have a story. Know who you are, know what you're aiming at, and be able to articulate it clearly. The students who struggle most in the job market are often the ones who don't have a clear answer to, what do you want to do? If you can walk into an interview and say, here's what I care about, here's what I've done to pursue it, and here's why I'm a good fit for this specific job, that goes an incredibly long way regardless of what your transcript says. Now this, by the way, is exactly what we work on with students when we do career work. If you're feeling lost about where to focus, given your grades and your goals, we work with law students one-on-one on exactly this type of strategic career planning. It's especially helpful if you're trying to figure out how to tell your story in a compelling way when your grades aren't doing the talking for you. You can learn more at lawschooltoolbox.com under the Job Help tab. I want to say one more thing before I wrap up, because I think it's important. Outside of the very top of the employer market, meaning outside of elite big law, federal clerkships, and academia, most employers are not sitting there with a red pen going through your transcript hunting for reasons to reject you. That is not what they're doing. They glance at this transcript, see nothing alarming, and then move on to the interview and the writing sample and the reference check. A B- in property is not going to sink you at the vast majority of legal employers. And I think students catastrophize about this. They get one bad grade and they're convinced it's the first domino in a career collapse. And it really, really is not. The legal profession is big. The number of students who come out of law school with flawless transcripts is tiny. Most lawyers, including most very successful lawyers, had at least some grades they weren't thrilled about, including me, by the way. My very first law school grade was in legal writing, and it was probably the lowest grade I have ever gotten on a transcript in my life. I cried on the floor of my aunt's house in Ohio over that grade. Then I busted my booty and ended up high scoring that same class the next semester. It really was not the end of my career. So let me leave you with a couple of takeaways as we wrap up. The first is know which path you're on and calibrate accordingly. If you're aiming at big law or federal clerkship or legal academia, grades really do matter, and you should know that and act accordingly. For literally everything else in the legal profession, which is most of the legal profession, grades are one input among many, and you have a lot of levers you can pull. Expertise, writing, networking, geography, specialization, your story. Build those pieces, and a lot of doors will open that don't require you to be in the top 10% of your class. The second is don't let the culture of your law school convince you that their career path is the only career path. Most law students are not going to end up in big law, and they're going to have really fulfilling legal careers doing all sorts of interesting work. Work that often has better hours, better quality of life, and more direct meaning than what the OCI conversation makes it sound like. Pick the path that's right for you, not the one that's loudest in the hallway at your school. And finally, if your grades aren't telling the story you want them to tell, start building the other parts of your story now, not in a panic, just thoughtfully. One externship, one clinic, one relationship, one writing sample at a time. You have more control over your career than your transcript suggests. Thanks again to Juno for sponsoring this podcast. If you're thinking about student loans for law school, head to joinjuno.com to explore your options and see how Juno can help you find a better rate. Okay, well, thank you so much for watching. Please give us a like, leave us a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss any future content.